21 black celebrities who lived in terrible homes. They were praised as icons, innovators, and legends. But the truth behind their success is far more complicated. Fame didn't protect them, talent didn't guarantee fairness, and history didn't always tell the full story. Behind every classic song and legendary performance lies a hidden cost few dare to discuss. In this episode, we go beyond admiration to examine the real forces that shape these black cultural giants: power, pressure, and personal choice. Stay with us, because this story may challenge what you think you know. Subscribe, stay curious, and comment your first reaction below. This is Black Excellence Legends. Diana Ross. Diana Ross is often remembered as elegance personified, but her rise was built on endurance rather than glamour. Before international fame, Ross grew up in Detroit's Brewster Douglas housing projects, a public housing complex marked by overcrowding, poverty, and racial segregation. Music was not a luxury, it was an escape. As a teenager, she joined a vocal group that would later become the Supremes, rehearsing relentlessly while balancing school and factory work common to many black families in the 1950s. Under Motown Records, the Supremes became one of the most successful female groups in history, scoring 12 Billboard Hot 100 #1 singles. Yet success came with tension. When Diana Ross embarked on a solo career in 1970, she faced skepticism, financial risk, and the pressure of proving she was more than a group's frontwoman. Her early solo years were unstable, marked by mounting expenses and uncertain public support. The turning point arrived in 1970 with Ain't No Mountain High Enough. The song reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, re-establishing her commercial power. Still, challenges followed. In the late 1970s, Ross faced declining sales and costly film ventures that strained her finances. Rather than retreat, she reinvented herself. Her 1980 album, Diana, sold over 10 million copies worldwide, producing hits like Upside Down and I'm Coming Out, songs that would later become cultural anthems across generations. Perhaps the most defining moment came in 1983, when Diana Ross performed a free concert in New York's Central Park. Despite severe weather and logistical failures, she returned the next day to finish the show, donating proceeds to rebuild playgrounds for children. The moment cemented her image not just as a star, but as a survivor. Diana Ross's legacy is not defined by uninterrupted success, but by resilience. She didn't remain relevant by staying safe. She endured reinvention, public doubt, and personal risk. Her story proves that true excellence is not about perfection, but persistence. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor did not invent honesty in comedy, but he pushed it further than anyone before him. Raised in Peoria, Illinois, Pryor grew up surrounded by violence, addiction, and instability. His childhood was spent largely in his grandmother's brothel, an environment that exposed him early to trauma, racism, and survival instincts. Comedy became his shield, not to escape pain, but to dissect it in front of the world. In the 1970s, Pryor revolutionized stand-up by abandoning safe punchlines and speaking openly about race, drugs, poverty, and self-destruction. Albums like That Nigger's Crazy and Bicentennial Nigger won Grammy Awards and permanently altered American comedy. His influence reached far beyond humor, shaping film, music, and social commentary by proving that vulnerability could be powerful rather than weak. However, Pryor's success intensified his inner battles. He struggled with severe cocaine addiction, paranoia, and mental health breakdowns. In 1980, during a drug-induced episode, Pryor set himself on fire at his Los Angeles home. He survived, but the incident exposed how deeply fame and addiction had consumed him. Rather than hide the event, Pryor later incorporated it into his stand-up, transforming personal collapse into brutal self-reflection. Multiple marriages, financial instability, and deteriorating health followed. Pryor was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a condition that slowly affected his mobility and speech. Yet even as his body failed, his voice remained sharp. His 1982 special, Live on the Sunset Strip, is widely regarded as one of the greatest stand-up performances ever recorded. Richard Pryor died in 2005, but his legacy remains foundational. He forced America to laugh at truths it avoided, proving that comedy could be both confessional and confrontational. Pryor didn't polish pain, he exposed it, and in doing so, changed culture forever. James Brown. James Brown's story is rooted in discipline forged by hardship. Born into extreme poverty in South Carolina, Brown spent part of his childhood in brothels and on the streets before being incarcerated as a teenager. Music became his path out, not through luck, but relentless control. By the late 1950s, Brown had built a reputation as the hardest working man in show business, demanding absolute precision from his band and himself. His innovation reshaped modern music. Brown shifted rhythm away from melody and toward the downbeat, creating the foundation of funk. Songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud were not just hits, they were cultural statements. His recordings became some of the most sampled works in history, forming the backbone of hip-hop decades later. Behind the precision lived volatility. Brown's leadership style relied on fear, fines, and intimidation. As fame grew, so did substance abuse and paranoia. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Brown faced multiple arrests and public incidents that contradicted his image as a symbol of Black empowerment. Allegations of domestic violence from his wife, Adriana Brown, were documented in police reports and court records, permanently complicating his legacy. In 1988, Brown was sentenced to prison after a series of offenses involving firearms and a high-speed police chase. The incarceration marked a dramatic fall for an artist once considered untouchable. Although he returned to performing after his release, the myth had fractured. James Brown died in 2006, leaving behind a divided legacy. He was a musical architect whose influence is immeasurable, yet his life demonstrates that discipline without accountability can turn destructive. Brown proved that genius can shape culture, but it does not erase consequence. Tina Turner. Tina Turner's legacy was not built on comfort, but on survival. Born Anna Mae Bullock in rural Tennessee, she entered the music industry through Ike Turner's band in the late 1950s. On stage, she became a force of nature, explosive energy, unmatched stamina, and a voice that carried both fire and pain. Offstage, however, her life was defined by control and violence. Tina later documented years of physical abuse, psychological manipulation, and financial domination during her marriage to Ike Turner, accounts supported by medical records and eyewitness testimony. By the mid-1970s, despite global fame, Tina Turner was nearly broke. When she fled Ike in 1976, she left with little more than her name and mounting debt. For years, she performed in small clubs, accepted low-paying gigs, and relied on food stamps at times to survive. The music industry largely dismissed her as a relic tied to a failed duo. Her transformation began slowly. Refusing to surrender, Tina rebuilt her identity through discipline rather than nostalgia. In 1984, at age 44, an age many believed impossible for a female comeback, she released Private Dancer. The album sold over 10 million copies worldwide and produced What's Love Got to Do with It, which earned her 4 Grammy Awards. Tina Turner became a solo superstar on her own terms, redefining age, gender, and resilience in popular music. In later years, she stepped away from the spotlight, choosing privacy over performance. Tina Turner died in 2023, remembered not only as a powerhouse vocalist, but as a symbol of rebirth. Her story proves that true strength is not loud triumph. It is the courage to leave, rebuild, and rise without apology. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke possessed a voice that sounded effortless, but his ambition was anything but. Raised in Chicago and trained in gospel music, Cooke crossed over into secular pop during a time when such a move was deeply controversial. Many religious leaders condemned the decision, yet Cooke understood the power of ownership and independence long before most artists. He was not content to sing, he wanted control. By the early 1960s, Sam Cooke was one of the most successful black performers in America. Unlike many of his peers, he negotiated contracts that granted him publishing rights and formed his own label, a rare achievement in an industry built on exploitation. His success allowed him to fund legal support for civil rights efforts and mentor younger artists behind the scenes. Yet Cooke's life carried contradictions. While publicly advocating dignity and equality, his private life involved complicated relationships and risky decisions. In December 1964, Cooke was shot and killed at a Los Angeles motel at age 33. The official ruling labeled the death a justifiable homicide, though questions surrounding the circumstances have never fully disappeared. No credible evidence has overturned the legal conclusion, but uncertainty remains part of his story. Released posthumously, "A Change Is Gonna Come" became an anthem of the civil rights movement, capturing hope shaped by struggle. Sam Cooke's legacy is not just in his voice, but in his vision. He proved that excellence without ownership is fragile, and that progress often comes from those willing to challenge the system itself. Otis Redding. Otis Redding's power came from sincerity rather than spectacle. Born in rural Georgia and raised in Macon, he grew up in modest conditions, surrounded by gospel music and hard labor. Before fame, Redding worked as a chauffeur and occasional backup singer, learning the discipline of performance from the sidelines. His voice was raw, urgent, and emotionally direct, a sound that felt lived in rather than rehearsed. Redding's rise was swift but grounded in craft. In the early 1960s, he became a cornerstone of Stax Records, recording songs like "These Arms of Mine," "Respect," and "Try a Little Tenderness." Unlike many soul singers of his era, Otis Redding wrote much of his material, channeling vulnerability rather than bravado. His music resonated across racial lines, particularly after his electrifying performance at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival, where he stunned predominantly white rock audiences without changing his sound or identity. Despite growing success, Redding remained deeply connected to his roots. He invested his earnings into building a recording studio in Macon, aiming to provide opportunities for younger black musicians who lacked industry access. There was no image of excess attached to him. His focus stayed on work, family, and artistic growth. Tragically, Otis Redding's life ended at just 26 years old. In December 1967, his private plane crashed into Lake Monona in Wisconsin, killing him and most of his band. Only days later, "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay" was released, becoming his first and only #1 hit. Otis Redding's legacy is defined by what he represented rather than what he accumulated. His career proved that emotional honesty could be revolutionary, and that even a short life can leave a permanent echo in music history. Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin was not born into ease, but into expectation. Raised in Detroit, she was the daughter of a prominent Baptist minister whose church attracted political leaders and gospel legends. From an early age, Aretha displayed extraordinary musical ability, mastering piano and vocal technique without formal training. Yet talent did not shield her from hardship. By her early 20s, she was navigating motherhood, financial pressure, and an industry that struggled to understand her depth. Her breakthrough came in the late 1960s, after signing with Atlantic Records. Songs like "Respect," "Chain of Fools," and "Think" redefined soul music by placing a black woman's voice at the center of power and self-determination. Aretha Franklin didn't simply perform songs, she transformed them into declarations. Her recordings topped charts and earned multiple Grammy Awards, but they also became cultural markers during the civil rights and women's movements. Behind the success, Aretha's life remained complex. She faced unstable relationships, health challenges, and periods of financial strain, particularly in later decades. Still, she never surrendered her authority as an artist. Unlike many contemporaries, Franklin retained control over her sound, often playing piano on her own records and insisting on creative autonomy. Aretha Franklin died in 2018 at age 76, leaving behind a legacy unmatched in soul music. She is remembered not only as the Queen of Soul, but as a symbol of dignity earned through perseverance. Her story shows that true excellence is not inherited. It is claimed, defended, and sustained through resilience. Betty Wright. Betty Wright's career was shaped less by spotlight than by survival. Born in Miami, Florida, she entered the music industry as a teenager, achieving early success with Clean Up Woman in 1971, a song that topped the R&B charts and crossed into the pop mainstream. At just 18 years old, Wright became one of the youngest female artists to score a major hit. But early fame did not guarantee long-term security. As musical trends shifted in the late 1970s and 1980s, Betty Wright's commercial presence faded. Unlike many stars who collapsed under irrelevance, she adapted quietly. Wright chose to remain in Miami rather than chase industry approval in Los Angeles or New York. Financial reality replaced celebrity illusion, and for years she lived modestly, far removed from the image associated with hitmakers of her era. Her true influence emerged behind the scenes. Betty Wright became a vocal coach, mentor, and creative anchor for younger artists navigating an unforgiving industry. She played a crucial role in the development of performers such as Gloria Estefan, Joss Stone, and later contemporary soul musicians who sought authenticity over polish. Wright openly criticized exploitative contracts and refused deals that compromised ownership, prioritizing integrity over exposure. In the 2000s, she re-emerged as a respected elder voice rather than a nostalgic act. Her later recordings emphasized maturity, resilience, and emotional clarity. There was no reinvention narrative, only continuity. Wright never denied the hardships she faced. She reframed them as proof that longevity requires adaptation rather than applause. Betty Wright died in 2020 at age 69. Her legacy lives not in chart positions alone, but in the voices she helped shape and protect. She demonstrated that excellence does not need constant visibility to remain powerful. Sometimes it survives by teaching others how to endure. Syl Johnson. Syl Johnson's music traveled the world long before his name did. Emerging from Chicago's South Side, Johnson blended blues, soul, and funk into recordings that carried raw emotion and street-level honesty. Songs like "Is It Because I'm Black" addressed racial injustice with directness rarely allowed on mainstream radio in the early 1970s. While the song limited his commercial reach at the time, it solidified his credibility among listeners who recognized truth over comfort. Despite decades of recording, Syl Johnson struggled financially. Many of his songs were later sampled extensively by hip-hop artists without proper compensation, leaving him largely excluded from the profits generated by his own work. For years, he lived in modest conditions, watching his music gain new life while his circumstances remained unchanged. The contrast highlighted long-standing inequities within the music industry, particularly regarding ownership and intellectual property. Rather than retreat, Johnson pursued accountability through legal channels. After prolonged disputes, he successfully reclaimed portions of his publishing rights later in life, finally receiving overdue recognition and financial restitution. The victory was not framed as revenge, but as correction, proof that persistence can challenge exploitation even decades later. In his final years, Syl Johnson experienced a revival of respect. New generations discovered his catalog, not as retro novelty, but as foundational influence. His work was acknowledged for its honesty, cultural relevance, and emotional weight. Syl Johnson died in 2022 at age 85. His story is not about fame denied, but justice delayed. He stands as a reminder that true influence often outlives recognition, and that integrity, though costly, eventually leaves a permanent mark. Clarence Carter. Clarence Carter's journey is defined by resilience rather than spectacle. Blind since birth, he grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, during a period when disability and race often meant limited opportunity. Music became both his language and his livelihood. Trained formally in classical piano before turning to soul and blues, Carter developed a vocal style that balanced vulnerability with confidence, refusing to be framed by sympathy or limitation. His breakthrough came in the late 1960s with Atlantic Records, where songs like Slip Away and Patches resonated with listeners across social boundaries. Patches, in particular, told a story of inherited poverty and responsibility, reaching number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and winning a Grammy Award in 1971. Carter's success was rooted in narrative clarity. He sang about struggle without romanticizing it. As trends shifted in the 1970s, Carter adapted again, recording funk-driven hits such as Strokin', which introduced him to a younger audience while keeping creative control. Unlike many artists who lost relevance, he navigated change without abandoning identity. His career endured because he understood how to evolve without erasing his past. Clarence Carter avoided the public scandals that consumed many of his peers, yet his life was not free of challenge. Touring demands, industry pressure, and the realities of being a blind black artist in a competitive business required constant endurance. Still, he remained active for decades, earning respect for longevity rather than controversy. Clarence Carter's legacy lies in consistency. He proved that visibility is not required for influence, and that excellence can be sustained quietly through discipline, adaptability, and self-belief. Percy Sledge. Percy Sledge sang heartbreak as if it were memory rather than performance. Raised in rural Alabama, he worked as a hospital orderly before music changed his life. There was no manufactured image, no calculated ambition, only emotion shaped by lived experience. That authenticity defined his signature song, When a Man Loves a Woman. Recorded in 1966, the track reached number 1 on both the Billboard Hot 100 and R&B charts, becoming one of the most recognizable soul ballads ever recorded. Unlike many one-hit wonders, Sledge followed with additional charting songs, yet he never attempted to escape the emotional gravity that defined his voice. His performances carried restraint, allowing vulnerability to speak louder than volume. Despite international success, Percy Sledge lived modestly. He remained in Alabama, maintaining strong ties to his community rather than chasing industry centers. Over time, changing musical tastes reduced his mainstream visibility, but his influence endured. His recordings continued to be referenced, covered, and studied for their emotional honesty. Health challenges emerged later in life, including battles with cancer, yet Sledge continued performing when possible. In 2005, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, formal recognition that arrived long after his most successful years. The honor confirmed what audiences already knew: his contribution was permanent. Percy Sledge died in 2015 at age 74. His legacy is not defined by output, but by impact. He reminded the world that a single song, when sung truthfully, can carry more weight than an entire catalog built on illusion. Odetta. Odetta was never interested in fame. She was interested in truth. Born in Alabama and raised in Los Angeles, she trained in classical music before finding her voice in folk and spirituals. At a time when Black female artists were expected to soften their message, Odetta chose gravity over glamour. Her voice was deep, commanding, and impossible to ignore, carrying the weight of history rather than commercial ambition. In the 1950s and 1960s, Odetta became a central figure in the American folk revival. Her interpretations of traditional songs connected slavery-era spirituals to modern civil rights struggles, making her music both historical and urgent. She performed at the 1963 March on Washington and was closely associated with civil rights leaders and activists. Martin Luther King Jr. reportedly referred to her as the Queen of American folk music, a reflection of her moral authority rather than chart success. Despite her influence, Odetta lived modestly. She never pursued pop stardom and often chose small venues over lucrative opportunities. Financial security was inconsistent, but artistic independence remained non-negotiable. Her career unfolded outside mainstream systems, allowing her to maintain integrity while shaping generations of musicians, including Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, who cited her as a formative influence. Odetta's later years were spent quietly in New York, continuing to perform and record without fanfare. She rejected nostalgia, viewing her work as living testimony rather than historical artifact. When she died in 2008 at age 77, she left behind a legacy defined not by awards, but by impact. Odetta proved that excellence does not require popularity. Her voice carried centuries of struggle, reminding listeners that music can function as resistance, memory, and moral compass all at once. Millie Jackson. Millie Jackson built her career by refusing to lie. Emerging in the early 1970s, she rejected the polished image expected of female soul singers and replaced it with brutal honesty. Her music blended raw vocals with spoken-word monologues that addressed sex, betrayal, power, and survival from a woman's perspective rarely allowed on record. Jackson did not provoke for shock value. She told stories that others were too cautious to voice. Albums like Caught Up and Still Caught Up created a narrative style that blurred comedy, confession, and social critique. While her explicit language limited radio play, it also earned her a fiercely loyal audience. Millie Jackson became commercially successful without conforming, selling millions of records while remaining outside mainstream approval. Financial awareness defined her career choices. Unlike many artists of her era, Jackson closely monitored contracts and spending, determined not to repeat the mistakes she saw destroy peers. When musical trends shifted, she stepped away rather than compromise control. She later moved back to the American South, living quietly and avoiding the industry spotlight altogether. Despite limited airplay, her influence expanded. Later generations of artists adopted her narrative boldness, crediting her with opening space for female autonomy in R&B and hip-hop. Jackson's refusal to sanitize her voice became her lasting contribution. Millie Jackson is remembered not as controversial, but as honest. She showed that excellence can be confrontational, and that survival in the music industry sometimes means knowing when to walk away. Her legacy stands as proof that truth, even when uncomfortable, can outlast trend-driven success. Jimmy Smith. Jimmy Smith didn't chase fame. He built a sound that forced the world to follow. Born in Pennsylvania, Smith was trained as a jazz pianist, but his true revolution came when he adopted the Hammond B3 organ. Before him, the instrument was largely confined to churches in background roles. Smith transformed it into a lead voice, redefining jazz, soul, and later funk with explosive improvisation and rhythmic authority. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Jimmy Smith became a cornerstone of Blue Note records. Albums like The Sermon and Back at the Chicken Shack didn't just sell well for jazz. They changed how audiences understood groove-based improvisation. His playing bridged jazz sophistication with blues accessibility, making instrumental music feel urgent and physical rather than academic. Despite commercial success, Smith lived far from excess. As musical trends shifted and jazz lost mainstream dominance, he withdrew from the spotlight. Rather than compete with pop culture, Smith chose isolation and focus. In later years, he lived quietly in the Arizona desert, reportedly without modern luxuries, dedicating himself to practice and spiritual reflection. There was no comeback narrative, no attempt to reclaim attention. Jimmy Smith's influence, however, continued to grow. His techniques became foundational for funk, soul, and hip-hop producers, many of whom sampled his recordings decades later. Yet Smith remained largely disconnected from the financial rewards of that legacy, highlighting once again how innovation often outpaces compensation. He died in 2005 at age 76. Jimmy Smith's excellence was never loud or theatrical. It was structural. He didn't follow trends. He created a language others spoke long after he stepped away. His story proves that some legends shape culture not by visibility, but by permanence. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry changed popular music by making youth the center of the story. Emerging in the 1950s, Berry fused rhythm and blues with sharp storytelling, electric guitar riffs, and lyrics that spoke directly to teenage identity. Songs like Maybelline, School Day, and Johnny B. Good didn't just entertain, they created the blueprint for rock and roll as a cultural force. Berry's influence crossed racial and generational lines. His guitar style became a foundation for countless rock musicians, while his narratives captured ambition, rebellion, and freedom in a way few had done before. Commercial success followed, but it arrived in an industry structured to exploit black artists. Contracts favored labels, leaving Berry vulnerable despite his innovation. Legal trouble repeatedly interrupted his career. In the early 1960s, he served prison time following a Mann Act conviction, halting momentum at the height of his influence. Decades later, further controversies damaged his reputation and complicated how audiences viewed his legacy. These incidents did not erase his contribution, but they permanently fractured public perception. In his later years, Chuck Berry continued performing, often alone on stage, carrying both reverence and discomfort from audiences who struggled to reconcile genius with misconduct. Financial security remained inconsistent despite decades of influence. Chuck Berry died in 2017 at age 90. His story embodies contradiction, foundational brilliance paired with personal failure. He helped invent the sound of modern music, yet his life reminds us that cultural impact does not guarantee moral clarity. Chuck Berry's legacy is not simple admiration, but enduring influence shadowed by accountability. Bill Withers. Bill Withers never chased celebrity, and that choice defined his greatness. Raised in a small coal mining town in West Virginia, he didn't enter the music industry until his early 30s, after serving in the U.S. Navy and working factory jobs. That late start shaped his perspective. He wrote from lived experience rather than ambition. His songs felt familiar because they were grounded in ordinary life. Withers' breakthrough came in the early 1970s with Ain't No Sunshine, a minimalist composition built on restraint rather than spectacle. The song won a Grammy Award and introduced a voice that sounded conversational yet profound. He followed with Lean on Me, which reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became a universal anthem of support, often sung during moments of collective crisis rather than commercial celebration. Unlike many artists, Withers resisted industry pressure. He openly criticized record executives for prioritizing trends over authenticity and refused to dilute his writing to fit radio formulas. As conflicts with his label intensified, he made a rare decision. He walked away. By the mid-1980s, at the height of respect but not excess, Bill Withers retired from recording entirely. His withdrawal was not driven by scandal or failure, but by principle. He chose privacy, financial stability, and family life over constant visibility. For decades, his music continued to circulate organically, sampled, covered, and sung across generations without his participation. Bill Withers died in 2020 at age 81. His legacy proves that influence does not require volume. He showed that honesty, when delivered without ego, can outlast fame itself, and that sometimes the most powerful statement an artist can make is knowing when to stop. Bo Diddley. Bo Diddley didn't just play music. he altered its internal structure. Born in Mississippi and raised in Chicago, he introduced a rhythmic pattern that became known simply as the Bo Diddley beat, a syncopated pulse rooted in African and Afro-Caribbean traditions. That rhythm reshaped rock and roll, influencing artists across genres without ever needing explanation. In the 1950s, songs like Bo Diddley and Who Do You Love established his sound as raw, percussive, and defiant. His rectangular guitar, homemade effects, and relentless groove made him visually and sonically distinct. Yet despite his innovation, financial reward rarely followed. Contracts favored labels, and Diddley received limited compensation for a rhythm that others would later build careers upon. As decades passed, his influence grew while his resources shrank. Bo Diddley continued touring, often under difficult conditions, repairing his own equipment and living modestly. Health problems, including diabetes and strokes, further strained his ability to perform, yet he remained connected to music until the end. Recognition arrived late. In the 1980s and 1990s, tributes and honors acknowledged what musicians already knew. Bo Diddley was foundational. Still, the acknowledgement did not erase years of neglect or financial hardship. Bo Diddley died in 2008 at age 79. His legacy is embedded in rhythm itself, proof that some artists shape culture so deeply their contributions become invisible. He reminds us that innovation does not always benefit the innovator, but it can still change the world permanently. Rufus Thomas. Rufus Thomas embodied joy, longevity, and survival in American soul music. Born in Mississippi and raised in Memphis, he entered entertainment long before the spotlight recognized him, working as a radio DJ, tap dancer, and MC while raising a family. Unlike many stars who rose quickly, Thomas built his career slowly, becoming a familiar voice in his community before becoming a national figure. His defining chapter began in the 1960s with Stax Records. Songs like Walking the Dog and Do the Funky Chicken captured a playful spirit that contrasted sharply with the heavier themes dominating soul music at the time. Rufus Thomas didn't preach. He invited audiences to move. Poor investments and unfavorable contracts limited long-term wealth, forcing him to continue performing longer than planned. Still, he rarely expressed bitterness. Instead, he embraced his role as a cultural bridge, performing alongside younger artists and adapting without losing identity. As the father of Carla Thomas, he also influenced the next generation directly, offering guidance while respecting artistic independence. His presence at Stax symbolized continuity, a reminder that soul music could celebrate life as much as it confronted pain. Rufus Thomas died in 2001 at age 84. Betty Davis. Betty Davis refused to be palatable. Emerging in the late 1960s, she challenged every expectation placed on Black women in music, embracing sexual autonomy, funk aggression, and unapologetic self-definition. A songwriter, performer, and stylistic innovator, Davis was not interested in fitting into the industry. She intended to disrupt it. Her music was confrontational by design. Albums like Betty Davis, she lived quietly for decades, largely disconnected from the fame she helped shape, surviving outside the structures that rejected her. Recognition arrived late, driven by reassessment rather than apology. Younger musicians cited her as a pioneer who expanded the boundaries of funk, performance, and gender expression. Yet Davis never pursued a comeback, remaining consistent in her refusal. Red Foxx. Red Foxx built his career on truths others avoided. Emerging from the Chitlin circuit, he developed a stand-up style that was unapologetically raw, blending social commentary with explicit humor long before mainstream audiences were ready. His comedy spoke directly to adult realities, earning loyalty even as it drew criticism. Before television success, Foxx released dozens of comedy records that circulated largely through Black-owned venues. Financial independence mattered to him, but inconsistent contracts and tax mismanagement undermine long-term security. When Sanford and Son debuted in 1972, Foxx became a household name almost overnight. The show's success brought wealth and visibility, but also personal strain. Despite high earnings, Foxx struggled with financial instability. Lavish spending, legal disputes, and unpaid taxes eventually overshadowed his income. After Sanford and Son ended, he attempted comebacks that never fully recaptured its momentum. His later years were marked by debt rather than decline in talent. Foxx remained a performer until the end. In 1991, he collapsed on set during rehearsal for a television project. Initially assumed to be part of an act, the moment tragically underscored how tightly his life was bound to performance. He died shortly after, at age 68. Redd Foxx's legacy is complex. He broke barriers for Black comedians on television while paying a heavy personal price. His story reminds us that success without protection can be fragile, and that laughter, even when powerful, does not guarantee security. After hearing these stories, one question remains impossible to ignore. Were these legends destroyed by a ruthless industry, or did their own decisions play an equal role in their downfall? History often chooses one narrative, but the truth usually lives somewhere in between. Some fought back, some walked away, and some paid the ultimate price. Now it's your turn to speak. Who do you believe was treated most unfairly, and who had chances they didn't protect? Drop your opinion in the comments and join the debate. Your voice matters here on Black Excellence Legends.